We certainly hope that you're enjoying our SECtember event so far. We've had a wonderful lineup of speakers, and this panel is no exception. As you can see, we're one short, so I will introduce you to the pros with whom I've worked many times before. What we're going to talk about is how one can sort of establish, create maybe a near perfect cloud protection strategy, what it looks like, what areas of the business that one should take into consideration when crafting and trying to maintain one, from visibility of the overall infrastructure to exposure management, prevention controls, detection and response, all that jazz. So here with me to explore these topics, very seasoned pros. At the end is Rick Doughton. He's our VP of Information Security and CISO of the Healthcare Enterprises at Managed Care Organization Centene. And then next to me is Jerry Cochran. He's the Deputy Chief Information Officer with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which is managed by the Department of Energy's Office of Science. So to kick things off, we've been talking a lot about how many organizations are well on their way to moving various and sundry workloads into the cloud, but they're just now trying to figure out, given all the mix of services, CSSPs, SaaS, microservices, et cetera, how to really deal with creating this protection strategy. From your perspective, and given some of the conversations you've been having, what are organizations getting right so far, and perhaps what are they missing? So, Rick, you want to start?
Yeah. I think, as mentioned earlier today, we need to understand infrastructure as a service, like putting everything in AWS or GCP or Azure. But the layers that we all know about, platform as a service and software as a service, and as one of the slides earlier today said, that most of the services is software as a service. And I think that the thing that we are certainly getting wrong was we're forgetting that is the cloud too. And while we don't have the visibility into it, as described earlier today, that is also something that's not under the application security group. And so we do a lot of greenfield development, we do some cloud native application development, but that team, we have a good process and CI/CD pipeline and doing all the right things we're supposed to do, but kind of not part of that part because other folks are charged, or the APIs for that matter, or no-code, low-code applications, which some of those software servers represents. So I would say that the thing that we need to really consider is all of them. We focus on the migration to the cloud of taking current, web-based applications that are sitting in a data center and making them, cloud native and moving them to containers and things like that. But we still forget about all the ancillary things along the edge. I think the thing we're probably doing well as industry is kind of understanding, the actual security of the components within the cloud. There's a lot of information from CSA and others about making sure that, permissions are there, and notwithstanding all the examples of people doing it wrong, that's no different than any other bad configuration management. So that's kind of how I'd start with it.
Jerry, what do you think?
Yeah, piggybacking on what you said about IaaS, if you ask what are we doing wrong, that was one of the first things we did wrong, is we moved to the cloud, and PNL started our journey in 2012 and started getting to the Amazon and Azure clouds. And the first thing we did is just started moving things from the data center to IaaS VMs in the cloud. And we realized, after probably too long that, gosh, we still have to do the same things to secure these that we did when they were in our data center. Oh my gosh, we're not getting any cloud savings by moving these things to IaaS VMs. And so it was that kind of the aha moment that probably a lot of us went through several years back, where we said, oh my gosh, the cloud is much more than IaaS VMs. It's really stupid for us to just, the classic conversation is, I need a website. Oh, let me give you a VM. That's not the answer, right? You don't need a VM for a website. You need a PaaS service like app services or whatever corollary service on other cloud providers. And so when we started to realize that the richer environment is the PaaS platform and what you build in cloud native, then it became a challenge to say, well, how do our developers, our IT engineering staff, and our cybersecurity professionals simply don't have the expertise. And so then it became a reskilling challenge. We had the expertise when it was just VMs. We don't have the expertise when you start to get into development security that a lot of the IT engineers and even cyber staff doesn't have.
So, okay, I'm going to diverge for a moment because that often comes up in the conversations we're having. And I think when we were meeting yesterday at the CXO Trust Summit, I may have mentioned that we were talking to one of our members recently, and he was having some difficulty filling a position. I think he noted that it had been open something like 9 months. Yep. And so there, certainly among our corporate members and chapters, there's a huge amount of discussion on upskilling and getting investment. And of course, CSA has a wonderful program to address that. But what did you start doing? What is the overarching program that you're developing to make sure that you have the right experts on your team?
I think for us, it's a multi-tier approach. We're starting to hire more of the folks that have the platform PaaS experience or developer experience. A cybersecurity analyst that also has some dev skills and has done development, knows about CI/CD pipeline, knows about DevOps, knows about containers and microservices. That's the first step. Then the other challenge we have in the skilling is the fact that you could nail it and know all about it on Azure, and then you've got to figure out how does it work on AWS and Google Cloud, right? And so it's not just a complexity of PaaS services, it's a complexity about those things and how they're implemented, managed, and secured across multiple providers.
Yep.
Right? So we've tried to hire more development-centric skills, and then the other thing is trying to fill some gaps, although this is not a panacea, is start to look at tools that help us get a handle on, like I noticed Orca is in the exhibit hall. We're an Orca customer, and we did that not because Orca is a panacea, we did it because it helps us start to get visibility across these cloud platforms and cloud services. And by comment, you can help the staff kind of upskill because then they start to understand and see the attack surface, and then they can go tackle how to upskill for that.
Okay.
Yeah, for us, 5 years ago we didn't have a cloud team, and so what they are now, and not to mention cloud security. So what they are now what we have is all these refugees, right, from application architecture, network architecture, network management, server management, things like that, who had the interest in coming into cloud and kind of looked at it as an opportunity. And so that's like the core. And even our cloud security team came from within the security team who had interest in it. But we can't expect to find, there's a finite number. I was talking to one of your finance people yesterday, and she said that even going for who's going to pay for it changes because the people with the point of contact keep going away because they're getting poached by everybody else, because it's a zero-sum game of who's going to be, we're just taking everybody's cloud people because there's not enough to go around. And so we have to build them. And it's kind of like, I ran pen test teams 20 years ago, and I didn't expect anyone to have ethical hacking experience at the time in 2000. And so what I did was I just hired for personality. Do you have the aptitude? Do you have the drive? Do you have the personality? Do you have the types of things to do that? And I appreciate the development mindset, scripters, people who look at automation, because cloud is all about automating. And so people who think in not how do I do this, but how do I do this once and then automate it going forward? That kind of mindset.
And the other thing you mentioned too is this idea that when you're using all of these different hyperscalers and you're trying to come up with this overarching security governance plan in a holistic way, that's hugely challenging. So what sort of steps have you taken there, Jerry?
Yeah, I think, one of the really simple examples we encountered really early on is, multi-factor authentication. And we started to say, okay, we had that on-prem, we have that on the client. Now, how do we do that for a VM in AWS? Or how do we do that for a VM in Azure? And you encounter these things, and every time the control is the same and the objective of the control is the same, but the implementation is different.
Sure.
And so you have to, first of all, kind of go to these the cloud providers and say, how do I implement this? And how can you help me implement these controls? But we've kind of taken a holistic look at, it's about the control, and it's about the intent and spirit of the control. And then how do we have, if it's at all possible, a common approach to that control is awesome, but very rarely that's the case. So we have to customize per implementation, per cloud provider. And sometimes, again, some tools can help. There are tools that we can kind of put in the middle and say, okay, well, we know that this tool will help us with some guardrails across these cloud providers. But even there's pitfalls there. We implemented a tool a few years ago that was supposed to provide multi-cloud support, and we found that multi-cloud support meant we're really good on AWS and we're dabbling in Azure and Google, right? And so it's just not possible yet. But the tools are maturing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's right starting with the capability. What am I trying to do? One of the things I think a lot of people realize is that all the stuff you put together to secure your enterprise before, on-premise and locally, doesn't necessarily work in the cloud. And so going with, well, what am I trying to get? I'm trying to make sure that my privileged access is, using multi-factor, that I need to go, that the same person can go from one cloud provider to another in a way that is, easy for them, that their users don't have a lot of abrasion in trying to do the things they want to do. And then from a security standpoint, what visibility do I need? What access do I need to be able to identify, respond, recover from these things? And then there's an education aspect of, incident response is very different. And how we're going to be able to do the security operations of it is very different. So I guess the re-educating of this is a new architecture and how, to the teams that already exist or are going to be supporting it now.
So we'll take a pause there for a moment, and then just considering those challenges, because we've noted in the summary quite a few that we want to tackle today, but are there more distinct priorities when we're talking public entities versus private, especially for those that are more vital to the critical infrastructure? I don't know, Jerry, you want to start with that one first?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. I spent 30 years on the private sector side with last 17 before I joined the lab with Microsoft. And so the thing on the private sector side is there's a whole different set of pressures on the compliance as well as the risk management side. And I tend to find that in the private sector, we're able to throw lots of resources. We're able to take a more of a business risk-based approach. But in the government, there tends to be more of a compliance-first approach, right? And so one of the things we constantly do in the Department of Energy, with at least at our laboratory, is try to say, how can we be innovative in that? We know we have to meet the check boxes of the DOE compliance and FSMA and U.S. government compliance, but how can we innovate, and actually how can we take a different approach that still achieves the spirit and intent of the compliance, but is more risk-based? So we've driven a real risk-based approach where, it may make sense that we have to check this box, but we actually can make a decision about, does that box actually reduce risk? And if not, it's lower priority, regardless of whether it's on the checklist. And so we focus on implementing and prioritizing the compliance that actually has the most impact on risk reduction versus just going down the checklist and say, I got that one, I got that one, I got that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an excellent perspective, particularly on the spirit of it, because that checklist was put together 10 years ago before anyone knew what cloud was. I mean, we knew what cloud was, but certainly from an audit standpoint. And so what I find, so what I find is that those checklists have not been updated. And so we're being audited by things that are not cloud native and are asking questions that don't apply. And so that's where the spirit of it is. So it's like, oh, all your servers need to have an EDR on it. Like, okay, yeah, but it's a temporary workload that's on a container that's up for 2 minutes. Why would I want to, is like, well, what you mean to do is like, do you have something that does, so exactly kind of going back and walking through and have a defendable case. Obviously appreciate, risk-based approach to what these are, but, we still have to check the box because that is a risk not checking the box. So how do we come up with a defendable case of like, we're meaning the spirit of it and describing it in this way, or like asking for a waiver until 5 years from now when the new version actually says, unless it's a temporary workload, you have to put EDR on it, as an example.
Excellent. One thing that we often hear from our members and from other CXO friends in the industry is this notion of having visibility of the overall infrastructure. And that might include the fact that you have some on-prem legacy kind of systems still in place that are necessary to the business. So what about getting a handle on the spread of your cloud services and also just maintaining that, again, a holistic look at everything that is operating your business? You want to start, Rick?
One of the great things about the cloud is nothing happens without being recorded, right? Now, notwithstanding, phantom IT where somebody comes in, but it won't be attached. If it's attached to my instance, then I'm going to know about it. And so Now, also notwithstanding that sometimes those logs are, not easy to get to, and you have to script to be able to get them, and all these other things. But that is an opportunity to be able to have better insight than, for instance, I would have no idea if someone plugged in a machine into my network until I kind of saw it on the network, whereas on the cloud, you can. But it's the connection of those two, because, like I said, we have these refugees who now started the cloud group. They're different than the people who are still managing the data centers, And so it's the reconciliation of this is what we have here, and this is what we have here, and how does it all relate? Because we especially have things that are, some of it is in a data center and some pieces are in the cloud, but it's all one system. And so being able to, in those that are very straightforward, we kind of get that. But asset management in the CIS critical security controls is number one, and it always will be, because I can't protect what I don't know about. And so where the cloud does it, extending the surface areas we always talk about, I think the good point about the question is yes, you have this new surface area, but you still have this stuff here, and how you can make sure that all of it's being covered.
Yeah, one of the things that the first approach I've always taken, because you can be obviously overwhelmed by this, right? Because if you have multiple cloud environments, multiple cloud providers, and you also have your hybrid on-prem environment, you could literally have so many panes of glass that it's just crazy, right? There's just so many tools. But I do generally say the approach we've taken for whether it's situational awareness about the threat or just what the assets are and who owns them, it's first of all, what does the cloud provider bring to the table for their environment? And I spent 3 years running Azure security engineering, another 3 years running Office 365 security operations. So having worked in a cloud provider, I do know that Office 365 has 1 billion customers on a service, and they actually do know the best way to provide you visibility. And then if there's gaps, you can build on top of them. So the first thing, I think the first strategy we took is, what are the cloud providers offering? Whether it's AWS with something like GuardDuty, or Cloud Log, or whatever the CloudTrail logging, they do provide tools to help you reduce the number of panes of glass to get a better picture of what's going on in the environment, the posture, the assets, their configuration, and then start to fill in, how do I actually integrate those panes of glass into more singular panes of glass, and then is there third-party solutions that I need to fill in the gap? So for us, that's, for example, why we invested in a cloud security posture management, because we said, well, here's a gap that we don't think the cloud providers are doing a really good job, and they're not doing it across all of our environments, but let's fill the gap. But then for the cloud security tools that come from Microsoft, Amazon, or Google, we're saying, well, we're going to natively use them because they know how to detect threats in their environment best. And then we're going to actually aggregate those alerts, and we're going to manage those as a central platform. And we're not, and as little as possible, we're going to not send a security analyst in the SOC pivoting between 20 panes of glass, because it's really hard. So. Yep. Trying to actually say, what do the cloud providers have? How do we aggregate that? And then how do we fill in the cracks with other tools?
And circling back to the staffing thing, that's where developers and script writers come in handy, because those logs are not just radio buttons to say turn on and send here. You have to write a PowerShell script or something to be able to get to them.
And so I want to talk about two things, because you mentioned cloud posture management too. So, and I think there are different names kind of being bandied about regarding this. I believe that Gartner now has come out with data security posture management. So who knows?
Some vendors here.
Yeah, so we're talking like the Wizzes, Orca, Normalize, all those organizations. I wonder if you have any advice for companies that might be looking into those types of solutions, perhaps, because you kind of have to have a pretty solid idea of what's going on in your own environment before you start looking at a solution to help you. Although some definitely tout their ability to actually help you with that basic sort of first step too. I don't know. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Well, the beautiful thing about them is they're crowdsourcing.
Yeah.
So it's like I have service accounts that goes in all the stuff they just talked about, and instead of a human writing scripts to pull it, they're just pulling it and putting it in a pane of glass, which is great. But it's kind of, just like with a SIM tool, it does nothing. It's a place to ask questions. And if you don't know what question to ask it, it's not going to give you answers. And if you don't know what places to pull the data to give you the answers to your questions, again, it's not going to work. So it's about good data coming in. So knowing what things I need to pull from to get the answers that I want. So that's where the strategy and the approach comes into of like, what do I need to know from a visibility standpoint, from a currency standpoint, from configuration management, vulnerability management, all those things, and then be able to pull from those sources into whatever the tool is to be able to let me know and then provide that to the organization that's supporting that, whether it's the vulnerability management team or the security operations team or the application architecture team or whatever. Some of them can create SBOMs or give good architecture diagrams. So like they all vary in kind of what they may be good at. But I would say, like, as with everything else, start with a plan of what you're trying to get out of it. And technology supports a process, not the other way around. And we've for too long have like bought a tool and tried to figure out what to do with it.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just piggybacking, it's the first question is which problem are you trying to solve, right? And I think what you've kind of figure out what questions, what problems you're trying to solve with posture management or data posture management or service posture management or API posture management, whatever you want to call it,
right.
Or whatever flavor that problem you're trying to solve. And then actually understanding, do the tools solve that problem? And do they solve it in a way, if you are multi-cloud, do they actually solve it in the multi-cloud? Or are you going to have to buy a new one for every cloud provider you use? And then finally, the thing that's bit us multiple times is you buy a tool and you find that whoever is administering and managing that tool did not onboard all the accounts and subscriptions in your cloud. So you're just like, again, Orca didn't pay me to use their tool as an example. I'm just familiar with Orca because we're onboarding Orca right now. And the first question I asked is like, oh, it looks great. And I said, the first question I asked is this covering all our subscriptions accounts across Google, Azure, and AWS? I'm like, I don't think so. And so it's like, that's the reason it looks so pretty is because you actually haven't onboarded the services to the tool. So the tool is telling you everything's really wonderful, right? And so it's also about understanding how the tools work, whether they're truly multi-cloud, what problem they're trying to solve. And again, there are tools that are varying in terms of the data, your data posture, data security, your just general services and compliance and, like, does it match a CIS baseline? And then there's other tools that get into, are your APIs protected and secure? And do you know about what APIs you have? So there's all those kinds of things. You may need to choose the right tool for the right problem.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, is that they don't all work on all platforms. And they don't cover all areas. Like, posture management may be great for the containers and the environment and the accounts and the data flow, but not the APIs, and certainly not software as a service company. So it's focusing on like what is most important to you based on your business and the business risk. And so you may choose. And we're all trying to reconcile to have like as few tools as possible, and one that may cover the two clouds that I'm on, though one may be better at this one or the other, but misses that. So yeah, all of those kind of come into play than just kind of rushing in and going after a pretty interface.
So I want to go back to the conversation about risk and delve a little bit more into some of the steps that one should take. We had Phil here earlier today, Phil Venables from Google, and we were sharing some of the data points from some research we did with Google in partnership. It was the Measuring Risk and Risk Governance research piece released in June. And we found that more than half, I believe, of the organizations stated they did not evaluate the risk of cloud services they're using after procurement, even though they're seeing a multitude of changes within their business environments, even with the solutions themselves. And then about 70 acknowledged that they had more than 100 cloud services operating in their environments that they know of. So you talked a bit about your risk approach, but how do you get it? Like, what does a program like that look like? Mm-hmm. What can organizations do more immediately? Mm-hmm. And then what's the long-term kind of view? Yeah,
so I think we're a pseudo government. The laboratory is actually a DOE entity that's operated by a private sector entity. So we're what's called a GOCO, government-owned, contractor-operated. So it's a really interesting mix. But what our approach is, obviously, as a government entity, we have to, when we onboard new services or a cloud service, one of our check boxes, and there's that procurement. Do you meet the NIST controls? Are you FedRAMP? And I think a lot of organizations stop there. It's like, okay, they've got the FedRAMP seal of approval. I'm good to go. I can just onboard them and start working in it, and we don't have to do any more. One of the things we've tried to do is recognize that wasn't going to fly. And the other thing is we take an interesting approach. We actually don't FedRAMP. What we do, which is an interesting, sometimes controversial subject in the Department of Energy, but what we do is we actually say, look, FedRAMP is nothing but NIST 853. We're focused on 853. If the cloud provider meets that, we will certify it, right? Mm-hmm. And so we don't ATO cloud providers, we ATO our environment, and cloud is just a service, it's just a technology, right? So that's one approach. The other thing we do is continuous assessment, continuous monitoring, right? And so the idea that you are continually evaluating the controls across those environments and cloud providers, continually testing them. And then the third prong is that we are actually continually, like we have, actually this week, we have a vendor that's pen testing our cloud environments and saying, hey, go break in, right? Mm-hmm. Go see if you can break in, because that's not the proposed or theoretical risk, that's the demonstrated risk, right? If you hire a pen tester. So I think that continuous assessment by our compliance team to say, are we meeting the controls? And what we do is we don't obviously don't assess all controls every year. What we do is we do a sampling of controls and we rotate around controls. And so over a period of time, we get complete coverage of the controls in across all the environments. And then by following that up with a real live, can you break it, hacker, then we kind of get, but again, I don't know that I don't know that I think that guarantees anything if I think about assumed breach, but I think it raises my assurance level and more sleep at night.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting approach, and I appreciate that you kind of acknowledge that, FedRAMP is the floor, not the ceiling. However, being compliant is a risk, because if I'm not compliant, then I can't do things, so at least make sure I check those boxes. So it falls into both the third-party risk management, which you may or may not already have, but Elena, when you were saying the question, I was thinking about both Phil and then Bob's presentation yesterday, where you talked about 99% of the organizations are like less than 500 people.
Yeah.
And, and we represent ones that are above that, and the 1%. And we think about, like, when we went through it, like with, Amazon, Google, or Microsoft, you're not going to do a third-party assessment. They're not going to send them a checklist to be able to fill out. There's like, here's our web page, here's all the stuff that has it, you will accept that or you don't play. And the reason why I say that is because, even in a big Fortune 26 company, we don't really have leverage with them. You have no leverage if you are the 99% of 500-person companies using these services. So you kind of have to trust them. And when I was a CISO 10 years ago of a 2,500-person company, I would kind of leverage that and I was wrong now that I'm in that position. I used to always say, there are people with a lot more lawyers, a lot more money that if there was a problem, they'd go after them. And I'm not assessing them now that I am that person. So I guess I was not thinking correctly about that. So it's, but I appreciate what you said about continuing to make sure that you are looking at your environment. You can kind of assume that they are, as Phil said, is listen, they got teams of people that are incentivized to keep their stuff secure at the baseline. What you add to it is going to make it insecure. So I want to make sure that I assess that what I'm putting on it is not introducing insecurities, and that risk is something that's acceptable, and we could do the identify with visibility and be able to respond and recover from it before it can impact the business. That's the kind of core of the risk management of it.
So you mentioned pen testing. I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about a program when we're speaking of prevention controls, detection, response. What are some of the top of mind areas that your respective teams are bearing in mind? What are some of the things that you're doing to address that so you can respond pretty quickly and then also ensure that, if necessary, you're engaging with the appropriate business partners within the organization? Mm-hmm. You want to?
Yeah, I would say starting with the things we don't do well. It's a lot of people kind of lean into the things they're good at. I'm a rock climber, and in my rock climbing gym, everyone's doing pull-ups. You don't need to pull-ups. You're good at that. Work on your core, work on your balance, work on the stuff you're not good at. That'll make you a better climber. And so for us, it's like incident response in the cloud, because that's a relatively new thing, and our incident responders are not dealing with that, particularly in cloud-native applications, and particularly in temporary workloads. It's like something happens, how do we kind of know what's going on? So all of the things that we were trained to do for decades in incident response, like that process does not apply in the cloud. So we're doing a lot of education and trying to get them to understand not just the architecture, what tools are available. Some are native to the cloud environment. Some of them are tools, like you mentioned, the posture management tools that give good visibility that interestingly become really, really good incident response tools because of the kind of stuff they're getting, because they're already in all the places I need to go anyway. So it's things like that. Identity management being another one, particularly across cloud, and making sure, service accounts, which are, as all the presentations talked about being a big weakness. And then finally, configuration management. Most people don't do configuration management well anyway, let alone the cloud, let alone at like DevOps speed. So, short answer of what I said at the beginning is like, focus on the things you know you're not good at first before like trying to better the things that you feel comfortable with.
Yeah, that's great. One of the things I think we've been focused on really recently with our plethora of cloud services and is recognizing long ago that identity is the new perimeter kind of thing, is we've been focusing more on not only strengthening our identity stack in the cloud, but also probing that more and looking for more holes in it, because I think we've had some presentation today is that this is a constant, right? It's usually the majority of the attacks have to do with something of an identity that's been compromised, and sometimes that's a token, sometimes it's a password and username, sometimes it's something else, but it's that identity being used as a way to pivot around the crowd and get access. So we've been hyper focused on that, not just on the response side and red teaming that and kind of practicing identity response scenarios, but also on the preventative side with kind of if you think about zero trust, kind of going down that path of you got to have strong auth, you have to have conditional policy based conditional access, you have to have instrumenting these identities with telemetry as well as the devices, the applications, the people, so that you can actually make risk decisions about authorization based on the risks they present to the environment. And so implementing things like conditional access or privileged identity management, or even going to the level of saying your privileged accounts, most people, if you talk to Microsoft or Amazon, Microsoft does not allow their engineers to operate in the cloud with out secure admin workstations. So they have to be on a separate workstation that's not where they get their email. So we're even exploring right now, we have a project to implement secure admin workstations, just to say for those few hundred, 400 or 500 privileged accounts we have in our environment, how do we actually harden them even more so that, because it is where we're seeing the vectors and where the focus is, so that's where we need to put our focus.
Yeah, definitely. So let's kind of pivot to the all-important agreements with your cloud providers, some of the other providers with which you're working. I think we talk a lot about shared responsibility, and I think there's the assumption that many understand that, but I have to say, too, that one of our most downloaded white papers is on shared responsibility as well. So let's just jump into it. I mean, how do you ensure that you're getting your partners to agree to some of the requirements you need to have in place? How do you ensure that they're beholden to those? Let's get any advice there?
It's funny because, having worked at a cloud provider for a number of years, they have large armies of weaponized lawyers that make sure that their user agreements and use agreements of their cloud services are ironclad. And so you have to make, and none of your amateur lawyers in small armies are going to be able to challenge their 70-page user agreement that they've spent a whole lot of time and investment protecting. So what you have to do then is look for ways, like one of the things we're trying to do is Microsoft and other cloud providers have performance and service penalties and bonuses. So for example, if your Office 365 environment has an outage, like Teams is out for a day, or your Outlook is out, or Exchange Online or SharePoint, OneDrive is out for a day, you can actually apply for credits back to Microsoft and say, we have 6,000 users. We can say, I have 6,000 users that were without Teams for 2 hours, and here's the policy on that. I want a refund and credit back to my service cost. I'd love to see a similar approach, and again, doesn't exist today, but by the way, I'm not an advocate for, fine for vulnerabilities. I'm an advocate for pay for security performance, meaning that if a cloud provider has security issues or has breaches or whatever, it's a direct kind of correlation to the money you're spending with them, not that they get fined because they had a vulnerability, right?
Yep.
Because I think that disincents, that's the wrong incentive, and having spent a long time with a software company, I know it doesn't work, right? So, but I do think there are ways that we can, we have the same in Azure. If you have an Azure VM outage and you have high failure rates in Azure VMs, you can go and get credit. So the same way is if we have some way of working with the providers to say, it's really about a performance penalty in the same way that you are, you're giving me credits when you have a service outage, I want some remediation when I have a security outage, right? So
Yep.
I don't have an answer, I just think that's where we need to go.
Yep.
Yeah, and it really kind of comes to the haves and have-nots. Again, being a CISO of a very small company, now being in a very, very large company, we have a lot more influence. And so next month, our global CISO and CTO are going to coming here, I guess, to go talk to them and our relationship, because we're two very big companies and we work about strategy and things like that. And I know that you can, when you have the funding and resources to buy extra service or extra access or extra reports or extra things that that 99% that Bob mentioned yesterday do not have access to. So it depends, and that's what, in all the CISO forums that I'm in and roundtables in the last 2 years, because they're all virtual, I've really seen that difference, that I'm in a different world being in a Fortune 26 company than most other people and what they have access to and can do. And so that leverage, Microsoft has lots of lawyers and everything like that. And well, so do we. It's not that we're going lawyer to lawyer. It becomes about relationships, I guess is what I'm saying.
But very quickly, are there limits to the leverage? Because certainly in the last couple of years, we've had conversations with large organizations that have talked about how it would be cool. One of the goals behind the CXO Trust is to have this group of CXOs together so that we can, and it's an iterative process,
Yep.
multi-year process, but where there is that collective voice and there can be some perhaps more concerted efforts to make some changes that we're seeing a whole group of organizations needing in these different services. So the leverage has some limitations, right?
Yes, but it's also kind of what you're describing is kind of like the airlines. The very frequent travelers who always get upgraded to first class are the ones that don't ever get bumped and things get changed for it because they're the ones making all the money. So if you have a group of people who are making a lot of money, it's in the interest of the provider to change to support them.
Sure.
From a business perspective, which is a good business decision. So that's really the core of what I mean about being in a big company, spending a lot of money with them. You have more leverage in general.
Yeah.
And so that's what I keep coming back to is like these haves and have-nots that we're kind of seeing, which is a whole security challenge anyway. And Bob made a good example of that when we talked about from CISA and what they're trying to do to help support small businesses and what things we can do with that, because we all need to be secure individually to be secure as a group.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think the government, if you think about the government side, they are trying to use the purchasing power of the federal government to drive things like SBOMs or whatever in terms of security differences, right? And the power of the purse does work if the incentives are aligned right. And I think most of the cloud providers, even the ones I don't like, they want their products to be secure, right? They want to have a competitive advantage. They want their customers to buy their products because of security, not in spite of it, right? And so there is an incentive for whatever cloud provider to do the right thing. And so whether it's a single large organization, a consortium of organizations, or the government using its procurement power, it works. I think it'll work.
So we have about 6 minutes left. I wanted to pause here to see if we have any questions from our audience.
Commenting about your urging us to manage our assets earlier today, earlier in your talk. I just want to challenge you all to rethink what an asset is, especially in the cloud.
To rethink, I'm sorry?
I can.
What an asset is, especially in the cloud. There is no such thing as an asset that is not data. Every single one of your assets is data. Your identities are data. Your money is data. What we need to do is make certain we know where the data is and not worry about the rest of it. Just a thought.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what we're here to protect, right? It's
The data.
Yeah, the data, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Like if we're talking about assets, assets in the cloud look different than assets in a data center.
Sure.
And if we talk about hardware and software assets, hardware and software assets, then, identity becomes one of those. The APIs become an asset. The little Lambda, becomes an asset. All of these things kind of become things, but it kind of goes to the change of their evolution. And you're right, they, all comes back to protecting the data from a security or privacy standpoint.
Yeah, I don't know if those are you in government. The government's rolling out their controlled unclassified information kind of requirements, and that's hitting all the agencies. So in the Department of Energy, in the Federal Register, there's something like 120 different data classifications, which is really scary. But as that boils down to the agency, there's far less. And so, we are. I think that we are driving towards. We've been focused on services, or we've been focused on people, or we've been focused on assets in the data center and the cloud, but that is driving a data-centric approach. And so I think, and there are tools coming out on, that's a burgeoning startup space with, data classification, data protection, data loss prevention tooling. Even some of the cloud providers have this built in already, and so there's a plethora of options that are kind of coming to bear in this space. And the challenge is it's not really just a technology issue, it's also a culture, a learning. If you have all these, you first have to know how to classify your data, and then you have to know what policies dictate how that data is protected. Then you have to finally, the last step is you have to map those policies and classifications and markings to the technical engineered controls you're going to apply to them. And so a lot of people just start with, well, I'm going to turn on Microsoft information protection and I'm good, right? And it's really a much harder problem than that. And so as we get to that data-centric asset kind of view, I think the toughest problem organizations have is just figuring out, how do we change the culture? I know in my organization, just changing users' behavior and culture to be able to apply labels to data, it's not even a technical problem. It's a workforce learning curve and culture problem.
Yeah, the data governance is usually lacking. And, for years, people implementing DLP tools without data governance doing all those things in the first place make them a lot less effective. There is a lot of new tooling out, a lot of new startups around this data provenance, data privacy, data use, for structured and unstructured data, especially for the cloud. But we're also kind of recovering from, FEMSA, we used to all be, FISMA used to, be system-centric. And so it's your system that you're protecting.
Yep.
And, and so we're trying to evolve to more data-centric. So a lot of the check boxes that we talked about earlier that were made 10 years ago are still system-centric and not data-centric, which is why we still care about assets.
All right, we have about 2 minutes left, real quick. Given, the different attacks we've seen, ransomware, we've got the Uber thing going on, and certainly taking into account your experience of many, many years, next 18 months, what are going to be some of the priorities for folks like you and your teams?
I would say, configuration management. All of these things, the list of things that we've been seeing with issues have all been, hygiene, configuration management issues. These are not like exceptional hacks using 0 days and something that was like, wow, we could have considered that. They were all like, someone made a mistake through money, time, resources, or politics, lack of, or too much of, that caused this not to be in a state that it should have been in, and we didn't know about it. And so making sure that all the doors and windows are taken care of. So it's like a focus on the basics to make sure that we're doing the fundamentals well before we try to do anything really extravagant.
Excellent. Jerry?
Yeah, I think the thing that's keeping me up at night is more the threat landscape continues to evolve. That's one of the reasons I love the cybersecurity field. The last 25 years I've been in it is it's always a journey and there's always a new challenge and you're never done. But as that threat landscape continues to evolve, I think that what keeps me up or worries me more is our ability to pivot across the complexity of particularly the cloud environment. Multiple providers, multiple service types, multiple attack surface types. And then as thinking about how that threat is so innovative, those threat actors are so innovative, they have such a massive attack surface to choose from. And that's what worries me most. It used to be, it's like when I started on this in the 90s, it was like, how do I protect my Windows NT environment? And it was like, that's hard enough, right? And now I think the attack surface in the face of that evolving, continually changing threat is kind of scary. And the skills challenges, it all adds to it. So.
Excellent. Well, please help me to thank Rick and Jerry for all of their wisdom.